This is the story of what it was like to be born as a megalodon, the largest shark that ever lived, and why, despite being the ocean's ultimate predator for over 20 million years, your life was actually a non-stop nightmare that ended in extinction. You don't remember being born because, honestly, the whole experience was pretty traumatic. Before you even entered the world, you were floating around inside your mother's body as an embryo, somewhere between 6 and 11 feet long, and weighing up to 500 pounds. You weren't alone in there either, you had siblings, but here's where things get dark right from the start. Megalodon embryos practice something called intrauterine cannibalism, which means you might have eaten your brothers and sisters while you were still inside your mom. The biggest and strongest embryos would consume the weaker ones, and your mother's body just let it happen because it meant only the toughest babies would make it out alive. When you finally got pushed out into the ocean, your mother didn't stick around to teach you anything. She just swam away and you never saw her again. Not because she was cruel, but because that's just how sharks operate. You were born somewhere in a shallow nursery area, places like ancient Panama or what would one day become the coast of Florida or Maryland. And despite being as long as a full-grown great white shark on the day you were born, you were still vulnerable. Other adult sharks from different species hunted in these shallow waters, and a 6-foot baby megalodon was a tempting target even if you were already massive by most standards. So there you were, alone in the water with no parents, no protection, and an empty stomach that needed filling immediately. Your body already required thousands of calories a day just to keep functioning, and that number was only going to get bigger as you grew. The first challenge you faced was learning to hunt, and unlike other baby animals that get shown how to do things by their parents, you had to figure it out through trial and error. You had 276 teeth in your mouth arranged in 5 rows, with 46 teeth in the front row alone, and those teeth were constantly falling out and being replaced by new ones from the rows behind them. Over your entire life, you'd go through about 40,000 teeth, which sounds impressive until you realize that losing teeth at the wrong moment could mean the difference between eating and starving. Your early diet consisted of whatever you could catch in the shallow nursery waters, things like sea turtles, large fish, and smaller sharks. When you bit down on something, your jaws delivered around 40,000 pounds per square inch of bite force, which was 10 times more powerful than a modern great white shark and even stronger than a Tyrannosaurus rex. One chomp from you could crush bone instantly, and when you attacked a sea turtle, you didn't just crack the shell, you obliterated it, sending chunks of turtle meat and pieces of shell floating down to the ocean floor while the blood clouded the water around you. But here's the thing about being a megalodon: you were never not hungry. As you grew, your caloric needs grew with you, and by the time you reached full adult size at around 24 meters long and weighing up to 94 tons, you needed approximately 100,000 calories every single day. To put that in perspective, that's like eating an entire cow and then some. Except you lived in the ocean where you had to hunt down fast-moving prey that didn't want to get eaten. Your body was built like a streamlined torpedo, similar to a baleen whale rather than the stocky build of a great white, which meant you could glide efficiently through the water despite your enormous size. Your cruising speed was only about 3.5 kilometers per hour, so you weren't exactly racing around the ocean. Instead, you relied on ambush tactics, hanging out in deeper water and watching the surface for movement. Your favorite prey was whales, and the way you hunted them was both brutal and effective. Whales have something called echolocation, which means they use sound waves to map out what's in front of them in dark or murky water. If you came at them from the front or the side, they'd sense you coming and have time to escape, but if you came from directly below, you were in their blind spot. So you'd swim deep, looking up at the surface where light filtered down from above, and you'd spot a family of whales just hanging out together, completely unaware that death was swimming beneath them. You'd pick your target, usually the largest one because more meat meant more calories, and you'd start swimming upward, building speed as you went. The whale wouldn't know you were there until the last possible second when your massive jaws, which could be up to 7 feet across, slammed into its underside from below. The impact alone was enough to break ribs and cause massive internal damage, and as your teeth sank into the whale's body, hundreds of them would snap off and fall away into the water. That didn't matter because new teeth were already moving forward to replace them, and you'd keep biting and tearing until the whale was dead and the water was thick with blood and chunks of blubber. You'd rip the whale in half, swallow massive pieces whole, and still feel hungry an hour later because your metabolism was insane. And this is where being a megalodon really started to suck because you had to do this constantly. Every single day you needed to hunt and kill and eat just to maintain your body weight, and if you went more than a few days without a successful hunt, you'd start to weaken. Unlike cold-blooded sharks that can go weeks without food, you were warm-blooded, or more accurately, you were mesothermic, which meant your body temperature stayed around 27 degrees Celsius regardless of the water temperature around you. A 2023 study using clumped isotope thermometry on fossil megalodon teeth confirmed that you maintained a body temperature similar to modern great white sharks, which run about 10 to 21 degrees hotter than the surrounding ocean water. This gave you advantages like faster swimming speeds, better brain function, and more efficient digestion, but it also meant you burned through calories at a terrifying rate. Being warm-blooded in the ocean is expensive, and you paid that price with endless, relentless hunger. If you managed to survive the early years and avoid starving or getting killed by other predators, you'd live for somewhere between 20 and 40 years, which sounds reasonable until you learn that you were still growing rapidly, even at 46 years old. Growth rings in fossil megalodon vertebrae show that you never really stopped growing. You just kept getting bigger and hungrier your entire life, which meant you never reached a point where you could relax and coast on your size advantage. Every year you got bigger, you needed more food to sustain yourself, and every year the ocean became a little more competitive. You weren't the only megalodon out there, and when two of you crossed paths, things could get violent. Sometimes you'd find a mate, and you'd do a sort of circling dance in the water before mating for a few minutes, and then swimming away from each other forever. You'd never see your offspring, and they'd never see you, and that's just how it worked for megalodons. No family units, no cooperation, no pack hunting, just solitary existence punctuated by brief moments of reproduction. The females would eventually give birth to those massive 6 to 11-foot babies in the same shallow nursery areas where you were born, and the cycle would repeat itself. Nursery areas were scattered across the globe in places like the Canary Islands, Belgium, Denmark, and ancient seas that no longer exist, and they were used over enormous stretches of time from the Middle Miocene all the way through the Pliocene epoch. These nurseries reduced early mortality and kept the megalodon population stable for millions of years, but they also meant that baby megalodons were concentrated in specific locations where other predators knew to hunt. Now let's talk about what you actually ate. Because for a long time, scientists thought megalodons were super carnivores that only hunted the biggest prey at the top of the food chain. That turned out to be wrong. A 2025 study that analyzed zinc isotope ratios in 18-million-year-old megalodon teeth revealed that you ate basically whatever you could catch. Zinc gets absorbed into your body only through food, and the isotope ratios showed that while you were definitely at the top of the food chain, you fed on creatures from multiple levels below you. You ate whales when you could catch them, but you also ate large fish, dolphins, other sharks including smaller members of your own species, seals, sea turtles, and pretty much anything else that moved. You were basically the ocean's equivalent of a garbage disposal with teeth, and your diet was closer to a modern great white's if it moves its food strategy than anyone previously realized. This actually makes your life even worse when you think about it, because it means you weren't just hunting big game for sport, you were desperately eating everything you encountered just to stay alive. For over 20 million years, this system worked. Megalodons ruled the oceans, nursery areas protected the young, and there was enough food to sustain the population. But around 3 to 4 million years ago, everything started to fall apart, and it happened slowly enough that you probably didn't realize you were living through the extinction of your entire species. The first sign was the water temperature. The Earth was entering what scientists call the Pliocene cooling period, essentially an ice age that was gradually freezing the polar regions and lowering ocean temperatures worldwide. For cold-blooded sharks, this wasn't a huge problem. They could just slow down their metabolism and deal with it. But you were warm-blooded, and your body needed to maintain that 27-degree internal temperature no matter what, which meant you needed even more food to generate heat, while simultaneously the cold water was making you uncomfortable and forcing you into smaller and smaller areas of warm ocean. The whales you loved to hunt started migrating to the polar regions where the cold water didn't bother them as much, and suddenly, your primary food source was swimming away to places you physically couldn't follow without freezing. The warm water habitats you needed were shrinking, and every other megalodon had the same idea about retreating to the remaining warm zones, which meant more competition for less food. And that's when the great white sharks really started to become a problem. For a long time, people thought great whites were descended from megalodons, but a 2022 study using mineral analysis proved they're actually cousins, more closely related to mako sharks than to you. But here's why that mattered for your extinction. Great white sharks ate the exact same prey you did, and they were smaller, faster, and more efficient. A great white only needs a fraction of the calories you need per day. It can survive in colder water than you can, and it can catch fast-moving prey more easily because it's not lugging around 94 tons of body weight. When food became scarce, great whites could survive on scraps while you continued to need massive meals just to function. They outcompeted you not by being stronger or more dangerous, but by being more economical, and in an ecosystem under stress, efficiency wins over size every single time. You started to see more dead megalodons on the ocean floor, other members of your species that had starved or frozen, or just given up. The nursery areas that had protected young megalodons for millions of years were becoming death traps because there wasn't enough food in the shallow water to sustain the babies, and without new generations surviving to adulthood, the population started to collapse. Your last years were miserable. The ocean you'd known your entire life was unrecognizable, colder and emptier than it had ever been. The big whales were gone. The warm currents you followed had shifted, and everywhere you went you found other megalodons competing for the same dwindling prey. You were constantly hungry, not just the normal megalodon hunger but the deep starvation that comes from weeks without a proper meal. You started eating smaller prey out of desperation, things you would have ignored when food was plentiful. A slow seal that didn't make it back to shore in time? A sick fish that couldn't swim fast enough? Anything that moved and had calories. But it wasn't enough, it was never enough, and your body started to break down from the constant stress and malnutrition. Other megalodons you encountered looked just as bad as you felt, and there were fewer and fewer of them with each passing year. The females weren't giving birth anymore, or if they were, the babies weren't surviving. The nursery areas sat empty, and the species that had dominated the oceans for 23 million years was disappearing in what was essentially slow-motion starvation. You were one of the last ones left, swimming through cold water that hurt your warm-blooded body, searching for prey that wasn't there anymore, growing weaker with each passing day. And one day, you just couldn't keep going. You sank down to the ocean floor, your massive body settling into the sediment, and you died there alone, just another casualty of climate change and competition that sealed the fate of the ocean's most formidable shark. The megalodon went extinct approximately 2.6 to 3.6 million years ago, with most evidence pointing to around 3 million years as the final cutoff. Some studies suggested a later extinction date based on teeth recovered by the HMS Challenger expedition, but those samples were later determined to be contaminated or misdated. By the end of the Pliocene epoch, every single megalodon was gone, and the great white sharks that had competed with you for food were the ones that survived to become the new apex predators. The extinction was selective for endothermic and mesothermic species, meaning warm-blooded animals like you were hit harder than cold-blooded ones, which is consistent with the theory that declining food supplies combined with cooling ocean temperatures created a perfect storm of environmental pressure that you just couldn't adapt to fast enough. Your size, which had been your greatest advantage for millions of years, became your greatest weakness when resources became scarce, because there's no such thing as a small snack when you need 100,000 calories a day. So that's why it sucked to be born as a megalodon. You spent your entire life hungry, hunting constantly just to survive, watching your species slowly go extinct around you, and ultimately dying alone on a cold ocean floor because the world changed and you were too big and too specialized to change with it. You were the most powerful predator in the ocean for over 20 million years, and none of that mattered when the Ice Age came and the food supply collapsed. The great whites survived. The smaller, faster, more efficient sharks survived. But you, the apex predator with the strongest bite force in history and teeth the size of a human hand, you went extinct while the world moved on without you. And that's why being born as a megalodon absolutely sucked.